Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining another Wines of Prestige tasting, this time Spirits of Prestige, with the illustrious Brad Japhe, who I'm going to let you introduce yourself because I'm never going to do justice to your bio. It's so colorful. But very thrilled to be doing this. This is a bit of a change for us. We typically do wine tasting since InVintory is a wine app, but a lot of wine lovers like myself love spirits. And so I think this is a really great opportunity to delve deeper into that world since I don't know that much about it. I assume most of the people on the call are here to learn more about it from the experts. So Brad, why don't you kick things off, introduce yourself, then I think we'll dive right in. And just a quick housekeeping note for everybody, this is being recorded. We are going to put it out later so that people can taste along, those who bought the tasting kit or those who still want to revisit what Brad says about the three spirits, since I assume you're not going to kill all three bottles tonight, just a hunch. And then we are going to be asking a couple trivia questions throughout the night, one for each of our spirits. So keep your mind sharp since there's some neat prizes to be won there. And Brad will tee those up to you when we get there. So Brad, over to you. Really happy to have you. Thanks so much for doing this.
Thank you so much, Yule. I really appreciate it. And it's great to be here tonight, drinking with everybody. Just the housekeeping that I want to say is we're here to have a good time. And I certainly don't want this to feel like some sort of classroom setting. So any questions that you have along the way, we will have like a dedicated Q&A where you can come on, I think, afterwards. But along the way, we have this chat here and I could see questions that you might put in there. So please type away and I can address those things. My name is Brad Japhe and I am a spirits writer and travel writer by trade. I can put my link to my bio in there in that little sidebar. But basically, I travel around the world going to some incredible distilleries, incredible places of production, from Scotland to Canada to Japan. Just trying to learn as much as I can about the production and also about the people and the history and the traditions that go into these liquids. I do write about all spirits, but whiskey is certainly a passion of mine, as is cognac. So I'm really excited to be able to delve into both of these categories tonight. And like I say, any questions that you have, this is my job. This is my livelihood. I live and breathe this stuff. So I love nothing more than talking about spirits. And the only thing that I like more than that is actually drinking them. So I would recommend just pouring something in your glass right now. I would say that probably given the three flavor profiles that we have here, I'm going to say that we should maybe start with the Martell, with the Blue Swift Cognac. So let's just pour a little bit of that into our glass. And if you have a tumbler, if you have a snifter, a lot of people like to use brandy snifters when they are drinking cognac. Cognac is a type of brandy that is specific to the cognac region, much like champagne is a sparkling wine that is specific to its champagne region. So a brandy snifter is, very traditional, but I'm totally okay with, I have a rocks glass here and I'm just going to be sipping my neat. You enjoy your spirit however you want to do it. I always suggest, though, taking just a small taste of it and letting it coat your mouth first neat without anything added into it so that you can kind of get a sense of what the producer intended. And then you have a couple of options from there. If you think that it's too hot, for example, with Blue Swift, we're dealing with something that's at 40% alcohol, so it should be very manageable for most people. But if we were drinking something that was higher in proof, cask strength, then maybe you'd want to add a couple of drops of water. Ice, I have a bucket of ice here if need be. The reason why I am not crazy about adding ice to spirit is that if you're dealing with something that's, has a nice, elegant, lengthy, complex finish, ice, when you bring the temperature down, it's going to constrict that finish and it's going to leave the palate faster. And for me, the joy really is in the finish and letting that linger on the back of your palate as it goes down your throat. And so you keep it like as close to room temperature as possible, really, in my estimation. But if you're finding that something is too hot, it's burning, you never want that alcoholic burning sensation, then, maybe one drop of ice might not be the worst thing in the world. Yule, I don't know if you have any preferences personally. How do you usually like to drink your cognac?
You know what? I actually like my cognac in a warm snifter.
Okay.
But for all of my other spirits, like I mostly drink Scotch as my preferred spirit. I used to order that when I was young and trying to get into whiskey because I thought it was cool. I would order that on the rocks and I never liked it. And then one day I had it in New York, neat. And it completely changed my life. And I've only been drinking it neat since then, maybe with a couple drops of water and always at room temperature. Because to me, that, as you say, like, it's just a nicer experience. That's how I think you get the full sensation of it, of the warmth and the flavor and
Right.
everything that's packed into that bottle.
Also, what I would suggest here is having 3 separate glasses, if possible, for each of the spirits that we're going to pour. And the reason why I suggest that is because we're going to take a sip of it right now. We're going to sniff it first. We're going to nose it. We're going to look at the color, do that whole process. But then we might want to revisit. I know I'm going to revisit and go back to where we started here with the Martell. And as it sits in the glass, and as our palate evolves with what we're sipping throughout the night, you're going to go back and you might taste certain things that you didn't taste right away. And also, believe it or not, like it's changing, it's modulating in the glass. You're getting to closer to room temperature, maybe if you had it sitting in a cellar or in a dark space. Also, there is very minimal, slight kind of oxidative type thing that can happen almost instantaneously if this is something that's been kept in the bottle for years and years, and now it's, getting its first taste of oxygen. It's not going to be, a profound difference, but 20-30 minutes sitting out there, it could make us, to your wine drinkers who I know have very, very particular and sensitive palates, they might be able to taste a slight modulation there. So as I was saying, like when we're approaching a drink for the first time, a spirit, much like you would with wine, you want to drink with your eyes first and kind of take note of the color that we see here. We're dealing with, so we're going to get a little bit technical here to start. This actually, if you're perceptive there and you look at the label, it says spirit drink on it. It does not say cognac, because very much to the particular specifications of the BNIC, which is the regulatory body of cognac, the Bureau National, it's French for the Bureau of Cognac. I'm sorry, I don't speak French, but they are very, very particular about the aging requirements. They're particular about everything when it comes to cognac. It's a very protected category. But one thing that's a big no-no is that you cannot age your cognac in anything other than French oak, or it could be oak that it could come from other parts of Europe. However, you can't have it, that oak couldn't have held anything other than wine or cognac in it before. So this is finished in bourbon barrels, which is very interesting and very unique. But of course, because bourbon is not a wine or a fortified wine of any sort, of course, that disqualifies this product from technically being called a cognac. So you read the label, it says spirit drink made with cognac VSOP, then finished in bourbon casks. So the technical term for this would be an eau de vie de vin. So eau de vie is, again, for wine drinkers out there or francophiles, eau de vie, water of life. That is basically how all brandy starts its life. Brandy just meaning any spirit that is distilled from fruit, in this case, distilled from grapes. It comes off the still and it will be eau de vie. It'll be a clear liquid. And then it goes into barrels. And at a minimum of 2 years in cognac, in the cognac region, it will then qualify as being a VSOP. A VS, which is the entry level of cognac. Then when you get to 4 years, it'll become a VSOP, which stands for very superior old pale, which is kind of like, it's a strange phrase, but that's just what VSOP stands for. And then at 10 years, it becomes XO. A lot of the XOs that you might have tasted in your life would be containing eau de vie that is 30, 40, 50 years old, Wow. It's not, you don't see in the realm of cognac age statements on the bottle. So you don't see something that says like, oh, this is 30 years old, like what you would see with a Scotch. You just would see XO, meaning that the youngest liquid that's in that blend of eau de vies is 10 years old. It cannot be an XO unless it hit that specification. So by all intents and purposes, this is a cognac. However, by the BNIC regulations, we're drinking a spirit drink. So sorry for all that technical background. Hopefully you've been drinking, sipping throughout some of this. I like to nose with my mouth actually slightly ajar. It is very different nosing spirit than nosing wine because you have a lot of these volatile compounds. You have concentrated alcohol, ethanol that can really blast out your nose if you just come into it like you would with a wine and dig in. So you got to be very measured with it. Let it come up to your nose slowly. And like I say, I keep my mouth slightly ajar and actually try and breathe in through my mouth instead of breathing in through my nose. And then you can kind of like activate that retronasal thing, and hopefully, you're perceiving it in the back of the throat more than right here in the nose itself. So when I start nosing this, I already get like some banana, like kind of tropical fruit. Also maybe like some caramelized pears, like definitely some caramelized action going on, which is what you would normally perceive, I think, from a bourbon. So we are seeing the impact, I believe, of this finishing that it receives in these bourbon barrels. Is this your first time trying this product, Yule?
This is my first time with this, yes. And I was about to ask you that, right? Because actually the color, just looking at the three lined up, this looks like the darkest color of the three. And this has quite a sweet nose, right? Quite a lot of that caramel brown sugar that you were mentioning. So I was going to ask if that was characteristic of cognac or if that was the bourbon coming through.
I do, when I taste this now, and the first sip, I just want to point out, I always try and take like a little tiny sip to let it kind of coat the inside of my mouth, because it's the subsequent sips where you're really going to kind of get to know that liquid. That first sip is really just coat, make sure that you create like a nice little film in your mouth, and really like, hello, just a very light introduction before you really get to know one another, the small talk, so to speak. And as I'm taking this sip, I really do notice, not just in the nose, but in the body, the mouthfeel and the finish, a lot of bourbon characteristics. And so I'm starting to realize like, hey, maybe the BNIC is onto something, because this doesn't necessarily drink with a lot of the dark fruit notes, like the plums and the rancio that you get from very old cognac. This drinks like kind of like a hybrid between a bourbon and a cognac, and I wouldn't necessarily know from the first sip, if I was tasting it blind, whether or not this is derived from grapes or from grain. So it's kind of interesting.
So what is it about the bourbon barrels that is so powerful? Like, is it the higher char level? Is it that it's American oak? Like, what is it that's having such an impact?
Yeah, definitely the char level for sure. So when we're using these barrels in cognac, they're always toasted. They're never ever going to like go to that level of charring the inside of them. And that really brings in those caramel notes, and it delivers like those sturdier barrel flavors that you associate with bourbon. So yes, definitely you're getting that, and it could overpower an eau de vie that was more gentle, shall we say, but it was really important for Martell to do this from a kind of a thematic standpoint. Martell is a classic cognac producer. They are part of what we call the Big Four. So between Martell, Hennessy, Remy Martin, and Courvoisier, those four houses, those four maisons account for like 85% of all cognac sales globally. So when you think about the fact that there's probably like, 200 plus cognac producers, the vast majority of them are just making up this tiny, they're all craft producers, small families that have been doing it, for centuries. But those big four, they own the lion's share. And Martell is particularly historic because it's the oldest of those four. It was founded in 1715 and also is the first one to ship its barrels to the United States. That was actually right after the Revolutionary War, way back in 1783. Obviously, we enjoyed a pretty strong relationship with the French at that time, as we still do. But, we were very happy with their help that they provided during the Revolutionary War. And maybe we were feeling like, hey, we'll celebrate with some cognac. Martell sent over casks of this to the United States. And so in order to kind of like celebrate that bond and that history between the United States and France, that was the impetus and kind of the inspiration for creating this Blue Swift product.
That's a neat story, although we kind of stuck it to them in the Judgment of Paris in 74, didn't we? So at least, we had a long history of that great friendship around alcohols. But we actually have a question from Dick. Do you want to answer this? He's asking if this is a medium toast on the barrels.
Yes, I think that they would consider this a medium toast. They don't have to disclose that information, but I do know from touring Martell that they go like lighter to medium with their toasting. Also, another thing to note with their barrels, the lion's share of cognac is going to be aged in French oak that comes from either Limousin oak or it's François I'm trying to like not butcher these pronunciations too badly, but with Martell tends to go with François, and the difference there being that it's a tighter grain that you get from François. It's what they call fine grained, and so what happens is you're going to pull out like a smoother sort of tannin than you would from the Le Maison. Le Maison is like a little bit more assertive and what a wine drinker would consider to be more tannic. This is less so when you're using that François oak. And so they're pretty committed to that, as well as committed to using grapes. So there's 6 crus that all cognac has to come from. And the main one, the kind of the most well-known, is actually called the Grand Champagne. And then there's Petit Champagne, and then there's Borderie. And Borderie is where you get these really like delicate fruits that I think are a little bit more difficult to work with, but they come away with like a very, very well-balanced profile. And that is what Martell is really fond of, using these Borderie grapes. So that's very indicative of the house style that they have.
That's interesting. Actually, if you're, since we're on that topic, can you maybe dig a little bit more into cognac in general? I don't know if you were going to go there anyway, but this is really interesting. I didn't know that there were 6 different crus and that they all have these distinctive characteristics.
Yeah.
But just talk a little bit about just cognac in general and what we can expect from those different regions. Right.
So like I say, there you have the 6 crus, predominantly, and I can type those out or send them to people in the sidebar. But if you want to geek out, it's Grand Champagne being that, and they go out in concentric circles, which is kind of cool. Like right in the heart of the Chanterelle River Valley is where you'll find Grand Champagne, and then it goes outward from there to Petit Champagne, then Borderie, then there's Finois and Bombois, and then there's Bois Ordinaire, which is like, that's the outskirts right there. And that's really like getting into the weeds and into the, geeky stuff. Importantly, like 98% of the grapes that are grown in these 6 crus are all one variety of grape, and it's Uni Blanc. And Uni Blanc is very interesting because it's very, very high in acidity. And so I've tasted it as wine. It's not going to be table wine that many of your fans in your listeners today, the audience is not going to enjoy that with fine, sophisticated palates that they have, because it almost tastes like a sour beer. If you've had that, or some of these natural low intervention wines that are sweeping.
The natty ones, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Like the funkier ones. I enjoy it actually because I do like sour beer, and I think that acidity in small doses can be very, very interesting. But for the most part, you can understand why, working with this grape, they're like, okay, and by the way, where that river valley is very close to Bordeaux as well. So it's like, we already have people in this region that have locked in to the grapes that grow really well here and do well as wine. This particular variety, let's maybe distill it, and see what happens that way. Now, the general rule of thumb, like, basically is that, for every 10 gallons, say, of wine that you'd make out of Uni Blanc, you'd come away with 1 gallon of liquid of eau de vie.
Wow.
So you got to make a lot of wine to come away with a good amount of cognac.
Yeah. So interesting. That's quite a bit of a loss there of the liquid.
Of course. Yeah. So you got to be really passionate about what you're doing. And the interesting thing that you'll note if you go to that region of the world is that even if you are, a big house like Remy Martin or, Courvoisier or Martell, in fact, they're only distilling so much of that liquid themselves in their own facility. They still to this day enjoy these great relationships with these local farmers where they're filling in the gap. And we started off at the top, we were talking about, blended Scotch. And it's kind of a similar process here where the blender of the cognac and who's maintaining this house style and making sure that there's consistency year after year, it's their job to go and secure these contracts and make sure that they can get these lines of liquid from these small farming producers to make sure that year in and year out, you're going to have a product that is very identifiable as the house style, in this case, as Martell. So that's really cool. And just knowing the fact that, like, much like with wine, like, this is an agricultural product, like, this is something that celebrates the hand of the maker and celebrates the farmers that make this thing happen.
Yeah. Oh, that's neat. That's a great story. Well, I could ask you more questions about cognac because I find this very interesting. I don't know that much about it. And it is fairly similar to wine in a lot of respects. And it's also next to Bordeaux. But do you think we should give everyone a chance to, if anyone has any thoughts on the cognac, by the way, please feel free to drop them into the chat or any questions about it. But we're already a third of the way through. So time always flies on these things. So maybe we should move on.
Absolutely. Like I say, leave a little bit in the glass. We will return to this. I certainly will. You're welcome to do whatever you want. I thought that was really easy drinking. There is those caramel notes that follow through into the finish. I personally, I wish that it had like a little bit more oomph to it, like just for my own palate, because I am somebody that likes things at cask strength. Like this is super approachable. So I would recommend this as like somebody that was looking to find an entry point into cognac that maybe isn't even a brown spirit drinker to begin with. Like this is a good way to get in there and kind of see like those brown sugars and, a taste, a small, like kind of hint, whisper of those prunes and the kind of dark fruit that we were talking about, and raisiny kind of notes that I like to get from my XO cognacs. So that's good. And then, we've got a nice little tie-in here because we're going to move on to Glenlivet, which is the best-selling Scotch. This brand is the best-selling single malt in the United States and has been for a number of years. But the beautiful tie-in here is that this particular expression, which we know to be 14 years old, is cognac cask selection. So this was finished in cognac casks. So we just had a cognac that was finished in whiskey casks, and now we're going to have a whiskey that was finished in cognac casks. So kind of a little circle story going on there, of course. But man, I could just talk about Scotch all day, like clearly for the next 35 minutes. So I'm going to try and be as brief with this, or as truncated as I possibly can.
Can I ask one question just out of the gates? Is the 14th an average, or is it the maximum or the minimum?
It is the minimum. So okay. There's no reflection in terms of what the oldest might be in here. It would be stupid from a marketing and sales perspective. This could be all 50-year-old Scotch. If there was one cask, a 14-year-old that was put into the blend because the distiller or the blender was just like, it works perfectly, then you'd still have to call it Glenlivet 14, even though predominantly it is a 50-year-old Scotch. Now, no way are the money people going to allow that to happen, but just by the rules, that's what would have to happen. A couple of things in terms of the parameters of production. And I didn't mention with cognac, same thing. It has to be a minimum of 40% alcohol or 80 proof. Kind of the interesting thing there, both with cognac and here in Scotland with the Scotch, it's an occupational hazard that there is the angels share. There is evaporation each year. Both places, both in the south of France and in Scotland, it tends to be about 2% per year volume that is left from that evaporates out of the cask. But the thing that can happen is that sometimes alcohol proof can go down as it ages. Okay, that'll happen sometimes, like in a drier environment. And the danger there, right, is that you could age something for many, many years, and then it dips below 40%. And now, if you're in the south of France, that's not cognac anymore; it's eau de vie.
Oh, no.
The same thing would happen in Scotch. Like it wouldn't be in Scotland; it wouldn't be Scotch anymore. So they have to be very, very mindful. Now, of course, you can always blend it with something that's higher proof, so that, because yes, when it comes to the proof point, that is the average of all of the blends, all of the liquids that have come together. So that's what you would have to do in that circumstance, but you wouldn't be able to release it as a single cask because it would no longer meet the requirements of production for that. Scotch needs to be made entirely in Scotland. As you might imagine, it needs to be distilled, aged, and bottled entirely in Scotland. So, if you took a cask of Scotch and you brought it down to London to like sit in a showroom, it's no longer Scotch at that point. So they like to hold on to their heritage, as rightly so. This is something that we've seen in the spirits world. A lot of areas of production have become kind of more guarded about the process. Sherry being a classic example, because for years you could ship sherry casks fortified wine to different parts of the world and bottle it in the port that it arrived at. And then sometime in the mid 80s, they're like, you know what, we're going to control this process and you need to bottle it here in Jerez in the Sherry Triangle. And that had some long lasting ripple effects throughout the world of Scotch, for example, because the Scots for many years have been aging a lot of their whiskey in barrels that formerly held sherry. Now, before the 80s, that meant that they could have just taken a barrel that was freshly dumped on site and still soaking wet with the sherry that was in it. But once this law changed in sherry in Jerez, that meant that they're really getting drier barrels, you know, because nobody's going to ship sherry and then not have it be sherry anymore. So just something to note. Has nothing to do with the liquid that we're tasting right now, except for just some interesting Scotch history. Again, for parameters of production, Scotch needs to be aged for a minimum of 3 years in oak. It can be any kind of oak. And so indeed, most Scotch on the planet is being aged in ex-bourbon barrels, just because, as we'll get to with our final sip, bourbon has to be aged in barrels that have never been used before. They can't reuse their barrels. So what that means is there's a lot of ex-bourbon barrels floating around the liquor industry. They're going to all different parts of the world. Tequila uses them to age some of their reposados. Cognac, as we've just seen, is even using them. And of course, Scotch, Japanese whiskey, you name it, they're using these ex-bourbon barrels, and they're great source of flavor, even after they're being used multiple times. So we're going to nose this here. I'm a big fan of Glenlivet. It is part of the region that we know as Speyside. It's actually kind of like the original Speyside whiskey. There's kind of seen as being, from a marketing standpoint, a Scotch marketing standpoint, four main production areas. There's the Highlands, the Lowlands, there's Speyside, which is kind of this area carved out of the Highlands, and then there's Islay. Islay is an island in the Hebridean Isles off to the western coast of Scotland, which is where a lot of those peaty, smoky whiskeys that we were talking about before, that's where they come from. And they're so strong in flavor that there's plenty of people out there, maybe even some people here tonight, that constantly consider or, you know, associate Scotch with something that's smoky. And that's just one style of Scotch. And in fact, it's a very small percentage of all the Scotch that's made. As we're about to taste here with the Speyside whiskey, it's not smoky at all. There's no peat. And yeah, so we have a question from Dick Wells about if they're using Tennessee whiskey barrels. Yeah, definitely. I've been in, I assume you're talking about Jack Daniels, also Dickel as well. I've been in tons of barrel houses in Scotland, dunnage warehouses as they call them, and you'll see the labels on there that say Jack Daniels, you know, and their Scotch is aging in these barrels. So you've got a softness here. You have definitely like a, what's the proof on this, by the way? So we're dealing again with something that's 40%. So I wouldn't recommend dropping any water in it to start with. And it's kind of weird, but like I get orchard fruit for one. So instead of the, you know, the kind of like the cinnamon and the caramel and the stuff that we were getting, like the dessert stuff there, here I'm getting like apples. So maybe we'll just, the power of suggestion, show you an apple and then you sip on that.
Yeah, Dick, I agree. This is not bourbon.
No,
There's almost a floral element to it, right? It's much more elegant. It doesn't have that sort of potency.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Now, I'm curious to know if anybody out there can kind of see that mirrored process going on if they taste cognac in this Scotch, because when we were tasting the first one, when we were tasting Martell, there's definitely for me a lot more evidence of bourbon influencing that than there is influence of cognac in this. This drinks like a Scotch. Like if you gave this to me, I know right away that this is Scotch, but it's a gentle, approachable Scotch for sure.
Mm-hmm.
A couple of things to note is that the Highlands, which is the general area, Speyside again is this region within the Highlands that is just chock-a-block with distilleries. It's just generally where historically where so many of these distilleries cropped up. And the reason being is because it was remote, it was disconnected from any sort of road system. So what they were trying to do was to hide from the tax man. You know, they were trying to hide from excise tax and from the queen and her tax collectors that would go around and try and extract the tax. And that was what made these distillers go further and further into the hinterlands. And then in the 1820s, this is actually in 1823, an excise act was passed by the crown. And what that did was it said, okay, look, we know a lot of you are out there moonshining. Like, it's basically amnesty. Like, we want you to do this above board. We want to be able to collect some money from you. So they put forth a more reasonable form of taxation in the hopes that some of these, moonshiners would go above board and kind of establish themselves as real businesses and pay a pittance, well, relatively speaking, a pittance to the crown. And that did happen. So when you look at a lot of scotches on the shelf, I want you to kind of look at the age that it says that it's established on it, not the age statement, but like established in what year. This one, 1824, you will see so many whiskeys, so many scotches that were founded right around that time period, 1824, 1825, 1826. I believe the Macallan is 1826. And it's all because of that change in the law, the excise tax, that so many of these, different legendary names that we know of today were established and became upstanding producers and not just moonshiners in the hills.
Nice. So I have a quick question for you. I have two questions, actually. The first question is, we talked about adding a couple drops of water. What does that actually do? Why do you do that?
So when you add water, and again, I recommend just a very, very measured amount. It's weird, the science behind this, but the flavor compounds, whether they're esters or they're micelles is another technical term, all of these different phenolic compounds they don't disperse themselves uniformly throughout the liquid, especially like as it's aging in a barrel. So barrel aging is very fascinating process, what it's doing on a molecular level. I mean, like, there's chemists that are still trying to understand that, but basically, there could be like little concentrated areas where a lot of these phenolic compounds are kind of huddled together, as opposed to it just being a uniform thing. And so the idea is when you drop in a little bit of water, what it can do is kind of free up some of those globules, some of those places where they're really congregating, and make it more uniform so that every sip can be a little bit more flavorful. You're not going to get like a little spot that doesn't have the same concentration of phenolic compounds as another area. So there is something happening on a molecular level. And then there's also just the idea that you are making it lighter and easier for your palate. So the one thing that makes it very difficult for people to taste certain notes is when you have something that's hot, that has too much ethanol in it, and it burns out your palate. So when you're bringing things down in proof, that's going to discourage that from happening. And we're going to be able to pick up more flavors because we're drowning the ethanol out and we're diminishing it and diffusing it.
Gotcha. Okay. Interesting. That's really interesting about the molecules that it kind of like.
I mean, I am not a chemist, but I've had chemists say that like this is still something that they're trying to understand. Also, I think it's really cool when you go hang out with a distiller, when they're tasting liquid, I mean, they'll cut it down to like 20% alcohol, because they really want to be able to dilute it and taste what's going on in there. So, if you're not afraid of having like a very watered down whiskey, I encourage you to do it, certainly from like an experimental standpoint, to kind of see if once you get diluted to that level, like, we're talking like almost like 1-to-1 cold water or room temperature water with the spirit, you might, find that you're tasting something completely different than, or picking up on different things that you didn't pick up on before.
So for the master distillers, when they're tasting, I mean, you mentioned that when it comes out of the still, it's clear, right? It's really just the color and the flavor develops in the aging process. So what are they tasting for at that point? Like, you've tasted stuff out of the still. What does it taste like?
Yeah, right. So it's important to note, and this exact figure is kind of like, obviously a point of contention, but they say majority of the flavor is coming from the barrel, right? Some people say 75%, 80% of the flavor comes from the barrel, whatever number they want to throw out, it's the majority. So the distillate is almost like an afterthought in that sense, right? If you know that, it's the cooperage, the barrels, that is the most important component of flavor. But if you start with something bad, you're still going to end up with something bad. So you need to make sure that the top notes that you're getting from your distillate, I think the most important thing is that you have like a window everybody has their house style and their window that they're aiming for. So say it's, we'll talk about another brand, which is Glenmorangie. Okay. They have very, very tall stills, famously tall stills. And so what they're trying to get in that process is like a fruitier, lighter type of whiskey. So they want a lot of fruit notes, maybe even some orchard notes, so then you also go to a different distillery, Glendronach, which is a personal favorite of mine. They're smaller, squattier stills. And so what that does is it encourages reflux, meaning that during the distillation process, just like if you've had heartburn, you have the liquid that's coming back into the still after distillation, and it's making a heavier, more robust spirit. And with Glendronach, for example, they know that they're going to be putting their liquids into sherry barrels, which impart darker, more, assertive flavors. So they want to start with a spirit that is more robust and can stand up to that. Whereas if you're looking for something like Glenlivet, which has these honeyed notes, heather, I think it's a very light, spry, vivacious kind of liquid to drink. There's a reason why this is the most popular single malt in the United States. So they want to make sure that they're starting with a distillate that has honey notes and has heather and a florality, because they want it to be like a hand going into a glove. The hand is the distillate, the glove is that barrel that's going to go over it and emphasize those flavors with time.
Gotcha. Interesting. Yeah, I love Scotch. Scotch is my favorite. So I think I would drink this over the Martell, but the Martell was also very good.
The swampy. Okay. So great question by Dick Wells. And so the swampiness is what we were referring to with peatiness. And, swamp is a great adjective and a great descriptor there, because bogs, if you've ever been to peat, the places where peat is cut from, they are swamp bogs. So peat, if you don't know, is basically like, it's vegetative earth. It's compounds, plant matter that is decayed slowly through eons, and it's decomposing slowly over time. I know I'm making this sound very appealing. And so essentially, if you let it keep going longer and longer, it would turn into, charcoal, it would turn into, not charcoal, but basically, what do you put into the feed your fire with? I don't know, not charcoal, but let's just say charcoal. But anyhow, like during that process, what's happening is earth is decomposing vegetative matter, and it's taking on these crazy, crazy strong flavors. And then what they would do in places where they didn't have any other heat source, like, coal, thank you. Regular coal, not charcoal. So in places where they didn't have access to coal, or they didn't have access to, the different fuel sources that you would use to fuel a fire, peat is what they use. So they cut it out of the bogs, and then they would roast fuel a fire with it. And that fire is being used to heat and malt the barley. And remember, Scotch, single malt Scotch, when you say single malt, it's 100% malted barley. And the barley is malted because you get it wet, you allow it to kind of germinate a little bit like it's going to sprout, and then you apply heat and you stop it, you cut it off. So what you've done is you've opened up like kind of like that kernel around it, and you're making the sugars that are inside accessible, because the sugars, as we know, is what yeast feeds on, and that's what's going to create your alcohol. So this is all the malting process in areas of Islay, the island I mentioned, and other places where they just didn't have access to trees for wood, for burning. They would use peat. And peat would impart that swampy flavor to things. And that was just the way that whiskey was made for thousands of years, for hundreds of years. And it wasn't because they wanted it necessarily to taste swampish. It's because that they were working with what they had. And then people tasted it and developed a taste for it. I'll tell you myself, I didn't like peated Scotch the first time that I tasted it. And I think most people don't. But once you get used to it, and once you kind of really develop the taste for it, not to say that you will or should, then nothing else is like that. It's just like, whoa, there's nothing organic that I can compare it to. Like, we're tasting this. I taste apple in here. I was saying that the orchard fruit that I get in here. Sometimes I taste whiskeys that I get, cinnamon, or I get spice rack, or I get sherry notes. But when I'm tasting a peated Scotch, there's no food that I could compare it to. You get tasting notes like tar or burnt rubber, or, iodine, seaweed. These are types of things but it's nothing that you would want to eat necessarily. Although I guess maybe some people like seaweed.
Well, again, it doesn't sound that appealing, but you're right. It's one of those things where when you get used to it, especially if you're a Scotch and cigar like lover, right? If you have a cigar, there's nothing that pairs better than an Islay Scotch.
I would agree with that. And I am not a cigar smoker, but the few times in my life that I have smoked a cigar with a whiskey, it has to be an Islay Scotch, because if the reason why I don't like cigars is because, like, for me, it kind of mutes my palate. I can't taste things. I can't taste subtle flavors when I'm smoking a cigar, and there's nothing subtle about peated Scotch. It's like, it smacks you. So, like I say, tons of things I could say about Scotch. Just one thing that, before we move on to bourbon, and the reason why we're ending with bourbon, I think, is because you'll find that this is the most full flavored. These first two products have been more subtle. This is, punchier, let's say. But Scotch, as we were just touching upon before, this is a single malt Scotch. Glenlivet is the producer. The most popular form of Scotch on the planet by far is a blended Scotch. Now, a blended Scotch is, as you might imagine, a blend of a bunch of different producers, a blend of a bunch of different single malts with a component of grain, what we call grain whiskey, which is a lighter spirit that's almost made like, it's made in a column still as opposed to a pot still. So it's a lot thinner. It could be derisively regarded as like a whiskey flavored vodka. It's a filler, but that's kind of like if you were making some sort of like rice dish or a pasta dish, like that's the rice or the pasta, that's the carbohydrate, the starch. And then all the flavors on top are what you get from the distilleries that you add in. So it's important to note that blended Scotches, Johnny Walker, the most popular blended Scotch on the planet, that there is no Johnny Walker distillery. That's a blended product. So some people go to Scotland and they're like, oh, I want to go to the Johnny Walker distillery, but they're a blender. They don't own, it's owned by Diageo, and Diageo has many different malt producers for sure. But Johnny Walker itself does not have a distillery.
That's super interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
So Johnny Walker Blue is, so one of the messages there is that blended Scotch doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to always be, cheap and cheerful or lesser quality. It's just a different approach. Because I think blue is is a fairly highly regarded Scotch, right?
Totally different approach. And again, like I would almost, there is an argument to be made that, blended Scotch is more artful than single malt, because it takes the hand of the blender to kind of come in and weave this thing together so that Johnny Walker Blue Label tastes like Johnny Walker Blue all the time, always. And it's very sophisticated. And I guarantee you that filler element, the grain component is, a lot less in that than it would be obviously in like Johnny Walker Red Label, which is like the entry level blended Scotch that they make.
So Dick, to your question, is it blended like wines in proportion? When Brad was speaking, it actually made me think of even like champagne, right? Like the chef de cave has to make sure that Moet tastes the exact same every year. So it seems kind of the same, but is it in proportions where it'll be like 45% this and, well, I guess smaller proportions, right?
Yeah, definitely. It has to be, but it's so much more complicated, I would say, when it comes to blended Scotch, just because the barrels that they're getting one year might be completely different than what they're getting the next year. So they can never get too locked in on those proportions, right? Because they don't know if the supply chain is going to be the same the next year as it is this year. So it's an entirely organoleptic process that usually takes place like by committee, several people that are all weighing in, trusted people that do it that way. And what you notice is that a lot of the most prestigious blended Scotches out there have female master blenders. And the reason being that women are blessed with, I would say, much better palates than men. You have a lot more taste receptors than men do. So physiologically, you are born to be better tasters than men are. So.
Well, chapeau.
So moving on to our final thing, we're coming back here to the States, and we're ending here with actually one of my favorite bourbons. I love everything from Maker's Mark, but I certainly love Maker's 46. And we're continuing a theme here because I'm sure everybody's familiar with flagship Maker's Mark, which has been, a classic hallmark bourbon since 1953. October 1st, 1953, if we want to be exact. But it wasn't until the early 2000s that Bill Samuels, who's the patriarch there, the president, introduced this first kind of brand extension, line extension. And that was with Maker's 46, which is like regular Maker's, only this one is served, it's at 47 proof, as opposed to flagship Makers, I believe, is at 45% alcohol. They tried to change that once, like to lower it to like 40%. People lost their mind. It was like, it might as well have been like New Coke or Coke 2,
Right.
it was like a big marketing misstep. So they recanted that very quickly. But anyhow, Makers 46, you're starting with that same liquid at a slightly higher proof. And what Bill Samuels did, he's actually a lover of wine. And he realized that if you put these dowels into the barrels and you hook these staves up to them, French oak staves, what you can do is you can modulate the flavor of the bourbon without actually having to finish it, meaning re-rack it, put it into another barrel. You don't have to do that. You just put it into these special barrels that from the start that have these dowels and these staves attached to them. It's like engineering genius, and it makes a big difference on the final product. But as I say, the theme that's connecting us all together here is we started with a cognac that is influenced by bourbon. We moved on to a Scotch that is influenced by cognac. And now we have a bourbon that is influenced by French oak. It's not cognac, but it's the same type of oak that would be used to age cognac in. So everything's coming full circle. The connection between whiskey and cognac, grape and grain, they're more intertwined than we might imagine. We've got a question here from Josh. How would you recommend I start? Okay, so he wants to really dive into both cognac and Scotch. And I appreciate that. I love that. And says that every time he has it neat, he doesn't typically enjoy it. Though I love dark coffee, dark beer, and wine. Are there more entry-level ways to develop your palate? I would say first and foremost to go with products that if you are a wine drinker, for example, try and find some wine barrel finished whiskeys, or, in this case, we're about to have a bourbon, which I think should appeal to a wine drinker. This one is at 47%, so 94 proof, as I noted. So maybe consider putting a couple of drops of water in. I have, not with me here, but a pipette that I keep at home, so I can literally just administer just like several drops into my liquid as I'm tasting it, because I don't ever want to like overdo it. You can always add more water, but you can't take it out, of course. Maybe
But you can add more of the spirit,
yeah, that's true. Good point. Also, maybe there's a psychological thing. I'm going to sip this out of a wine glass. So maybe, there is so much pageantry to drinking wine, right? As there is to spirit, that we love and we find it comforting to come back to these rituals that are always the same. So maybe if you consider putting it into a wine glass, swirling it around, giving it the attention and the affection that you would for your favorite glass of wine, maybe that might shift your perception there a little bit. That's entirely a psychological thing. But physiologically, objectively, there is a great component of, I want to say like a very tannic French wine, pick your poison there, that integrates itself into this particular bourbon. Okay, so immediately, because we're talking about bourbon, it is aged in virgin cooperage barrels that have never been used before and are charred. They char the hell out of these barrels. So you are going to get immediately, the cinnamon, the caramel, vanillas, like that's not just by chance, for example, because some of the actual wood compounds that are extracted during that charring process are actually the same compounds that you would taste in vanilla or caramel. Like vanillin is a wood compound, a wood sugar that comes out when you're charring wood. So it's not just that it tastes like vanilla, like it is vanilla, you know? So these are the types of things that you get from bourbon, but there is to this, like I said, there's more of like kind of like a tannic kind of grip to it. And obviously that has to be from the French oak that it only sat with, by the way, that dowel goes in and it sits for only like 2 months. And it still, I think, makes a pretty profound impact.
Yeah, you do really notice the alcohol though. I mean, Dick is noticing this too, right? It is noticeably higher than the others.
Yeah.
To your point, maybe a drop of water would help there.
Yeah. I mean, to me, I love that. I
Yeah.
really,
You're a
that's
seasoned palate though, Brad.
that is something to be appreciated. It's rich too. There's a richness to this. I would want to have this as a dessert. Like I would want to have this with like French vanilla ice cream. It would just be splendid. So yeah, just another couple of production notes here. Scotch, bourbon are both whiskeys. They're particular types of whiskey. So obviously all bourbon is whiskey, not all whiskey is bourbon. All Scotch is whiskey, not all whiskey is Scotch. The main thing to note when you're talking about straight bourbon means that it needs to be made in the United States. Contrary to popular belief, it does not have to be made in Kentucky. This one is 95% of whiskey of bourbon comes from Kentucky, which is why a lot of people think it has to. It can come from any of the 50 states. And I believe as of now, there is bourbon being made in all 50 states. There's bourbon being made in Hawaii right now. So it can come from anywhere in the United States. It needs to be aged for a minimum of 2 years to be called straight bourbon. And really, a minimum of 4 years, because if it was less than 4 years as a straight bourbon, they would have to put the age statement on the label, and nobody wants to say like 3 years old because that just doesn't seem impressive. So it's almost always 4 years and above. And unlike Scotch, unlike Cognac, where these liquids can withstand decades and benefit from decades in oak, in bourbon country, certainly when you go to Kentucky and you talk to distillers, they're going to tell you that the sweet spot is usually 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, maybe years in the barrel, but you do not want much more than that, because then it's just going to get like overly tannic, overly woody, and there's not going to be the balance of flavor there. It's going to be one note, and you're just going to be, it's like biting into your desk. So if you like the taste of your desk, then go for like, that esteemed Pappy 23-year-old bourbon, which people spend a lot of money on. So some people have a taste for it, but most bourbon connoisseurs will tell you that they prefer bourbon or Pappy 15 over Pappy 23. So save yourself some money there by getting a younger product that actually tastes better.
Interesting. I didn't know that. So that's unique to bourbon.
Yeah, and the reason why, there's 2 reasons. One, the virgin cooperage, right? The barrels that have never been used before. So the time-tested analogy here is to think of like making tea, a tea bag, right? Like the first time that you dip that tea into the hot water, it's going to be, it's going to get everything. You're actually going to get some tannins in there as well. But then if you reboil water and put in that same tea bag, you'll still get color and you'll still get flavor from the herbs in the tea bag, but it's not nearly going to be as potent. So all these other regions of the world reusing our barrels, they're kind of going in for the second dip. We're the ones that are using it only one time, and that is a law that was passed in 1964 by an act of Congress that stipulated that bourbon needs to be 51% or more corn. So that's an important thing to note, is that it's predominantly a corn-based mash bill, or mash bill is how we refer to basically the ingredients, the grains that go in. It has to go into virgin American oak, charred oak. It could be toasted. I don't think that the law says that it has to be charred, but that's kind of been the tradition. But it does have to be unused. And there's a couple of other very technical details that make bourbon. One is that it can't go above 160 proof. It can't go above 80% during distillation. So vodka and neutral grain spirits go up to like 96% during distillation. That makes a big difference. And the reason why is because we want to be able to taste that grain. We don't want that distillate to come off like a vodka. We want to be able to taste the things that went into it. And then finally is that when it enters into the barrel, It can't go into the barrel higher than 125 proof, which is 67.5% alcohol. And so that's just an interesting thing, because sometimes you will see bourbons, like Booker's bourbon is one that's really popular with bourbon geeks because it's very high proof. It's got, you have to be very, muscular to enjoy something like that, and that is higher. You'll notice usually the releases are higher than 125 proof. The reason why is because, as we talked about, that angel share during evaporation, it's actually losing more water than it's losing alcohol, because Kentucky is very humid in the summertime, and something about the humidity in a barrel house, when it's humid and hot, you're going to lose more water out of the barrel than you're going to lose alcohol. So after 5, 6, 7, 8 years, you could have a product that's as much as 140 proof, or we were talking about Tennessee whiskey before. Jack Daniels released a product called Coy Hill last year that came from like the top rung of one of its barrel houses, where it gets really, really hot in a Tennessee summer. You can't even imagine how hot these barrel houses can get. And that product was, I believe, 150, or is like 150 proof, right?
Jeez.
150 proof.
You could light it on fire.
Absolutely. It's like 151. You absolutely could light it on fire. I think it's anything above 57.4% is flammable. So that clearly qualifies. And some people probably think they are drinking fire when they drink that stuff. But amongst the bourbon geeks, like, they went crazy for it, because there is this thing with bourbon drinkers, and I'm guilty of this. Like, I do like a very assertive bourbon. Like, this is 47%, right? This is 94 proof. This is like the lowest that I would ever want my bourbon to be. To the person that had asked before, was it Josh, trying to dabble in, I would recommend Basil Hayden is a great bourbon for people that are trying to enter in, because that's either famous or infamous, depending on, your flavor profile, your personal preference. It's famous for being very easy. It's 80 proof, and it's, that's not to say that it's like facile, that it's like doesn't have complexities going on, but it's just like, you can drink it, you can taste it's not going to fight you going down, so to speak. So Basil Hayden is a great entry level bourbon, I would suggest.
Good tip. Well, gosh, Brad, we are cruising through here. We have a minute left, so I think we should do trivia for a minute. And then if you're good to stay on for a minute or two, just to see if there are any additional questions.
Oh, of course, absolutely.
We'll give people a chance. Okay, so everybody prime your computer fingers. The first person to type this into the Q&A or into the chat wins the prize. There are 3 different prizes. 2 of them are InVintory hoodies. The third is a full-size bottle of whichever of these spirits you like best. So the first question for a hoodie: 90% of cognac distributed in the US comes from the 4 main maisons of the regions. Can you name them? If you're listening closely, Brad may have mentioned these. So yeah, what are the 4 main maisons?
Reading comprehension here,
Right? I know. Skill testing questions.
I didn't mean to give anything away.
Oh,
so they
Martel. Josh, you got 1 out of 4.
So it's whoever's the first to put it into the Q&A. Is that
into the Q&A? So tell you what, everybody, I'm going to give you the next question while you're thinking on this one. In the interest of time, it's a Scotch question. What does the term single malt mean exactly? What is single malt?
We touched on that a little bit.
We did. That's a good question. Oh, any figures? Does Dick get it?
Dick is partially right. That is half correct. You've got the single part correct.
Yeah, if you can add in, what does malt mean?
Okay, DB is.
Oh, DB. Did you take it?
DB got number 1 correct.
Okay, nice. Dick, we're still waiting on you for that other half of the answer.
Single malt. You have identified the single part is correct. What does the malt mean?
Brad, you actually described very well that malting process with the particular substance that is malted.
That is one of the real joys of visiting Scotland and seeing production is I would highly recommend going to one of the few distilleries that are left out there that do some of their own floor malting. And Springbank is a great example of this. They actually do all of their malting. A lot of them just, okay, I mean, yes, Hauser, but what is that grain is the most important. Because it can only, you're right, it is a single distillery and it can only be made using one grain. But what is that one grain? That is, that is not correct.
Dick.
Corn.
Dick was in a bourbon mindset.
But yes, if it is coming from bourbon country, then you want it 51% or more corn. And really, you're pressed to find in bourbon, by the way, anything that is 100% corn. Normally, it's around like 60-65% corn. The remaining 35% is going to be some combination of rye. And this other ingredient, which we're still waiting for somebody to name, that single malt is entirely made of. Also, an interesting thing to note is that you'll hear people talk about wheated bourbons. So in those circumstances, the wheat will stand in for rye as the secondary grain. What we're tasting today from Maker's 46, from Maker's Mark, is a wheated bourbon. So there's no rye in this bourbon. It's predominantly corn and then maybe 30% wheat. The wheat will give it like a sweeter, what we say, like a more rounder flavor profile than if it was with rye, which is going to give you more savory, spicy notes, as you might imagine from like rye bread, for example, caraway seed. Very similar there.
Brad, I have some good news. Hauser has successfully answered our question.
Oh, okay. So he did it like privately or something. Oh, I wasn't scrolling down. Yep. Okay. You are correct. Dick, I agree with you. I love rye. It's one of my favorite whiskeys on the planet. And unfortunately, we didn't get to try any tonight, but I'm a big fan of Whistle Pig. I'm a big fan of, what is the other one that I really like? Well, I like tons. I love Old Overholt, which is really, affordable, thankfully, or it was, and Michter's does a great rye as well. But yes, so single malt is 100% malted barley coming from one distillery. It doesn't have to come from one cask. It can be a blend. It is almost always a blend of casks from that one distillery, but it can involve liquid from any other distilleries. So today we tasted single malt from Glenlivet. This is all made at Glenlivet Distillery. And it is all made from 100% malted barley in one place. So that is what single malt means.
Perfect. So we're down to our last grand prize trivia question. This ties in nicely to what you were speaking about a moment ago. In order to be called bourbon, it has to be distilled predominantly from corn, more than 51%, but there are also other grains that can be used. So name the 3 most popular cereal grains that go into bourbon mash bills other than corn. So 3 other grains.
It's almost like we were just talking about this. Sorry, I don't mean to continually be giving away the answers here. Oceans, yeah, that is a good, if you're talking about Jefferson's aged at sea. Dick, I don't know what you mean by oceans, but Jefferson is a great bourbon that is aged on the ocean. So they take the bourbon and then put it onto shipping containers and, let it travel around the world, pick up a lot of flavor along the way, maritime flavor, but also theoretically, as it's rolling and rocking and rolling on that ship, it encourages interaction between the liquid and the barrel.
Dick, you are so close. The question was, what are the 3 grains other than corn? And you did get 2 of them.
Yep, that is 2 out of 3.
And as a hint, the third, does Hauser have it? Correct?
Yep.
Oh, Hauser, you already won the other one though. So unfortunately, you cannot win 2 grand prizes. So tell you what, we're going to give one of the prizes to, we're going to give the prior prize to Dick, and we're going to give you the grand prize because that was good that you got that one right. So Dick, you get a hoodie. Hauser, you get a full bottle of whiskey. And DB, you get a hoodie as well. We'll be mailing those out. So I'll reach out to everybody to get your sizes and your addresses after this. And I know that we are a few minutes after 9, but does anyone have any other questions for Brad while we have this spirits brain here? It's a good time to pick it. I have a lot of questions myself, but I don't want to keep everybody up. So last chance for any additional questions before we sign off.
I will answer anything as long as it's related to whiskey or cognac. I can't
why is your maker's mark already about half empty there, Brad? That's my question.
Oh yeah, I was going to bring that up, but as you can tell, I'm a big fan of this product. So it is on heavy rotation in my home bar for sure. And I also am a big fan of their what is it called? The wood barrel finish series. So it, again, for people that are looking for entry points to get into bourbon, if they weren't necessarily big bourbon drinkers before, definitely seek out their wood finishing series. They do 1 or 2 of those a year. It's higher in proof, so add water if you need to. Also, make sure to go out and check out the Kentucky Bourbon Trail. I am a card-carrying Kentucky colonel, so it is my job and my duty to to advocate for the state, for the bluegrass state. But it is such a incredible experience to go out there and see these places in person. And Makers, especially, like, has this crazy history because, believe it or not, they opened their visitor center in 1980. And believe it or not, like, visitor centers were not a thing. Distilleries were like factories. You don't show up at like, a glue factory and be like, hey, like, let me take a tour and peek underneath the hood.
For yourself.
I don't know how into glue you are, but whiskey is the same thing. It was just a workhouse. And so they changed the game, Maker's Mark, in 1980. And again, it was Bill Samuels and his family and his wife who had this foresight to be like, you know what, people are going to want to come see this production. And now when you go to Loretto, Kentucky, which is about an hour outside of Louisville, it's like stepping back in time. It's a very classical feel there, and they've kind of pushed the envelope forward by incorporating art. They have a beautiful Chihuly glass exhibit that you walk through as you go into the barrel house, and then a real kind of just flagship moment of the tour that's great for Instagram is you will get to dip your own bottle into the red wax, which is just, who doesn't want to do that? And then keep your own bottle that you will not want to open because you're like, no, this is me that did this. My hand.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Perfect. Well, you know what? I think we do not have any more questions. I've just shot a quick note to Dick and Hauser. If I could get your emails, then I'll just follow up after this. But first, I want to thank, before I thank Brad, I want to thank Spirits Network for helping put this all together and providing these wonderful spirits that we have. They're wonderful, and they have such an amazing array of spirits to dabble into and lots of content. And that's how we got in touch with Brad. So thank you so much to Spirits Network for helping put this together. Huge thank you to Brad for leading us through this tasting that just flew by. We could have done this for definitely more than just this short little hour that we had. And you shared already so much of your knowledge, but we'll have to do it again to get even more. So thank you for taking the time. This was really great.
Of course, I appreciate that. And I just, Yule, I want to say thank you so much for having me and for being a great moderator here. I would also say that to the Spirits Network point, that I host a show there called Sipping Point, which is really fun. And it's a conversational look at whiskey production, spirits production across all categories with the people that make it. And that extends to distillers, that extends to blenders, that extends to bartenders. And it's very conversational, right? Because we can geek out on this all day long, but really it's about the conversations that arise while you're drinking it. And hopefully it's in the background, the spirit, and it's more about like inspiring other sorts of conversations. So that's what Sipping Point really leans into. People can read my work. If you just Google my name, which is spelled Japhe, and that's Brad Japhe. Eula was getting me back before because I had only seen her name written out and I thought it was Yule, and she's like, oh, Brad Jaff.
I thought it was Jeff.
No, we're even now. So
we have the silent E problem down.
It is, the silent E strikes again. But yeah, so please check out my work. This is what I do every day, like probably about 3 or 4 articles a week that I post about traveler spirits. So I'm really passionate about this kind of stuff, and always happy to answer questions if you want to email me directly. So
Perfect. Okay. Well, Hauser, I still need your email address that I can make sure to connect with you. For everybody else, thank you so much for joining us. You're the ones who make these tastings really fun and interactive, and it was fun to do the trivia. So thank you for playing along. I hope you all enjoyed your spirits and enjoyed the evening, and we'll do more of these soon.
Cheers, everyone.